My mother kept her spa weekend, while my lung collapsed. Then, my father's letter. Took everything. I was 30 years old, living alone in a small but tidy apartment I'd worked hard to afford when I learned that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. My parents had divorced when I was 22, and in the years since, I'd built a life that was entirely my own. A steady job, a handful of close friends, a Saturday morning routine of coffee and grocery runs that made me feel, for the first time, like an adult who had things figured out. My mother, Diane, had always been a woman obsessed with appearances. She measured her worth, and everyone else's, in brand names, vacation photos, and the number of likes under her latest post. She wasn't cruel in an obvious way. She was worse in a way. She was absent in plain sight, always present at the party, always missing when it mattered. My father, Robert, was her opposite. Quiet, practical. A man who showed love through actions instead of words, fixing a leaking faucet without being asked, showing up an hour early to help me move, never once expecting a thank you. Despite everything, despite years of watching my mother choose herself over almost everyone, I still believed that if something truly terrible happened to me, she would come. I told myself that underneath the vanity, there was a mother in there somewhere. I was about to find out how wrong I was. It started on an ordinary Saturday. I was carrying 2 bags of groceries up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment when a sharp pain stabbed through my chest, just under my ribs. I froze on the landing, certain I'd pulled a muscle. I set the bags down, took a breath to shake it off, and the pain doubled. Then tripled. Every inhale felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. I told myself to walk it off, the way I always did with minor aches, but within minutes I couldn't draw a full breath at all. My hands started to shake. The hallway tilted. Sweat broke out across my forehead, even though the building was cool. I don't remember deciding to call my mother. My fingers just found her name in my phone because she lived only 30 minutes away, closer than anyone else I knew. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if I could just hear her voice telling me it would be fine, it would be fine. She picked up on the 4th ring, and behind her voice I could hear splashing water, low music, someone laughing. She was at a spa resort 2 hours outside the city, a well-deserved weekend to herself, as she'd posted the day before. "Mom," I gasped. "Something's wrong. I can't breathe right. It hurts so bad." "Sweetie, you're probably just anxious," she said, and I heard the clink of a glass. "You've always been dramatic about this stuff." "Mom, please, I really think I finally have a weekend to myself," she said, and her voice had an edge to it now, the edge she used when she felt inconvenienced. "Don't ruin it. Just call an ambulance if it's that bad. The package here is non-refundable. I'm not driving 2 hours for a panic attack." I tried to speak again, but she was already talking to someone beside her, laughing at something I couldn't hear. And then the call went dead. She had hung up before I could say another word. I stood there in the hallway with the phone in my shaking hand, staring at the black screen, and something in me went very quiet and very cold. There wasn't time to feel it yet. There wasn't time for anything except survival. I don't fully remember dialing emergency services. I remember fumbling with my keys at my own front door, my vision blurring at the edges, my chest screaming with every shallow breath I managed to pull in. I remember sliding down against the doorframe, the metal cold against my back, and thinking, absurdly, that I hoped I hadn't left the stove on. Then there were voices, hands, a stretcher, the sting of an IV, fluorescent lights sliding past overhead. At the hospital, the diagnosis came fast. A spontaneous pneumothorax. My lung had collapsed on its own, with no warning, no injury, nothing but a quiet failure inside my own chest. A doctor with tired eyes explained that they'd need to insert a chest tube immediately to release the trapped air, and that if my lung didn't begin to re-expand on its own, I'd need surgery. I nodded along, agreeing to things I barely understood, terrified in a way I'd never been terrified before, and utterly, completely alone. When I woke from the procedure, the room was empty. No mother pacing by the window, no father gripping my hand, just the steady beep of a monitor and the dull ache of a tube taped to my side. A nurse came in to check my vitals and asked, gently, "Is there anyone we should call? Family?" "They're traveling," I lied, because the truth was too humiliating to say out loud. That my mother knew, that she'd known and chosen a hot tub instead. Hours later, alone and unable to sleep, I made the mistake of opening my phone. There she was, smiling by an infinity pool, a mimosa in hand, a photo of an elaborate seafood dinner, a close-up of her getting a massage, eyes closed, utterly at peace. The caption beneath it all: self-care isn't selfish. I set the phone face down on the blanket and let myself cry, quietly, so the nurses wouldn't hear. My father arrived the next morning, his coat still creased from where he'd slept in it during the drive. A neighbor of mine, alarmed by the ambulance, had tracked down his number and called him. He didn't ask why my mother wasn't there. He simply pulled a chair beside my bed, sat down, and took my hand like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Over the following days, he paid for everything insurance wouldn't cover without being asked. He slept, curled in that same stiff hospital chair night after night, waking whenever I stirred. He walked beside me down the hallway when the physical therapist had me practicing steps again, matching his pace to my shuffling one. One evening, as the sun was going down outside my window, he sat quietly for a long moment before speaking. "Did your mother know," he asked, "how serious this really was?" I told him the truth. He didn't react with anger. He just nodded slowly, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected, and looked down at his hands for a long time. It was during that same visit that he told me something I hadn't been prepared for. He'd received a serious medical diagnosis of his own a few months earlier, one he hadn't told me about because, he said, he hadn't wanted to worry me while I was building my new life. He'd already updated his will. And in the quiet months since his diagnosis, he told me, he had found himself watching people more closely than he ever had before, watching how they behaved when they thought no one important was paying attention. "Character doesn't appear during celebrations," he told me, his voice steady. "It appears during emergencies." I didn't fully understand what he meant by that yet. I would. My mother finally visited nearly a week later, only after word had spread among relatives that I'd been hospitalized and she'd realized her absence had become a topic of conversation she couldn't control. She arrived with a bouquet of flowers, the price tag still dangling from the cellophane, and spent the first few minutes angling her phone for a selfie beside my hospital bed before she'd even asked how I was feeling. She posted it within the hour. The caption read, "Family is everything." She stayed for 10 minutes before glancing at her watch and announcing she had a dinner reservation she couldn't miss. I didn't cry after she left. I think by then something in me had simply gone numb to her in a way that felt almost like relief. The months that followed were slow ones. My lung healed, gradually, the ache fading into something I barely noticed most days. I stopped returning my mother's calls. I started therapy, sitting in a small, quiet office once a week, learning to name the grief I'd been carrying without a name for it. Piece by piece, I built a steadier version of my life. My father remained a quiet, constant presence through all of it, driving up on weekends, sitting with me over coffee, never once bringing up my mother unless I did first. Our relationship, which had always been solid but understated, became something deeper, something I leaned on. Then, without warning, complications from his illness took him. It happened faster than any of us expected, and the funeral came together in a blur of dark clothing and hushed condolences. My mother, to no one's surprise, made a spectacle of her grief in front of the gathered guests, dabbing at dry eyes, accepting embraces, already in low tones to my aunt, mentioning that the house would probably need to be sold. Everyone assumed, without question, that she would inherit nearly everything. She assumed it too. A week later, the family gathered in a lawyer's modest office for the reading of the will. My mother sat with the composed confidence of a woman who had already spent the money in her head. The lawyer, an older man with careful hands, opened a sealed envelope that had been left with explicit instructions to be read aloud. Inside was a letter, handwritten in my father's careful script. He had written that he'd watched over the final months of his life, the way neglect and devotion had played out in front of him without either of us saying a word about it. He wrote that he had quietly looked into the day of my hospitalization, the ambulance records, the call logs, the hospital's timeline of admission, even the public posts my mother had shared from that spa resort while I was fighting for air 3 floors underground in an emergency room. He had gathered it all, methodically, the way he'd always done everything. "The day my child couldn't breathe," the lawyer read, his voice steady in the silent room. "One parent chose comfort, the other chose responsibility. I have chosen accordingly." The will left me the family home, the savings, the investments, and a small bundle of personal letters my father had written over the years and never sent. My mother, the lawyer explained, was entitled only to the modest legally required minimum, nothing more. She came undone in the office, her voice rising, accusing everyone in the room of manipulating a dying man, demanding the lawyer read it again as though the words might change on a second pass. He simply set the supporting documents on the table between them. The timestamps, the printouts, her own captions staring back up at her in black and white. One by one, the relatives who had gathered to support her began quietly gathering their coats instead. No one defended her. The image she'd spent a lifetime constructing didn't shatter all at once. It simply, finally, stopped holding. In the months that followed, I used what my father left me with care. I bought a modest home, nothing extravagant, just enough space to feel like mine. I started a small charitable fund for patients recovering from lung illnesses, people who understood, in a way most others didn't, what it meant to fight for a single breath. My mother reached out more than once in that time, her messages always circling, eventually, back toward money, toward the house, toward what she felt she was still owed. I stopped answering. Some evenings, I take out the last letter my father wrote to me and read it again, though I know it by heart now. He wrote that love isn't measured by what someone says when life is easy. It's measured by who walks through the hospital door when breathing becomes a privilege instead of a given. My collapsed lung healed a long time ago. The illusion I'd carried for 30 years, that somewhere underneath it all, my mother would show up when it truly counted, never did heal, and I've stopped waiting for it to. Accepting that, as painful as it was, turned out to be the first real breath of the healing that mattered most.